That Christmas Eve was almost perfect. The night was cold, stars scattered across the sky, and the warmth of our little house wrapped around us as we put the last few ornaments on the tree. My sisters and I had begged Mom to keep us up just a little longer, just a few more minutes to make Christmas last, to stretch out that magical night. We'd pulled out all the tricks we knew.
Just one more story, Mommy. Please? Can we sing one more carol?
She had laughed, indulging us, but finally, just like every year, she promised us Santa wouldn't come if we were awake, and up we went. Reluctantly, but with a kind of breathless anticipation of the morning. So, up we climbed, leaving her by the tree. I still remember her face, warm with the soft light of knowing her children were happy. Only, it didn't stay that way. The scream was what got me. It ripped right through the house, thick with fear. I didn't know it was my mother's voice right away. There's something in a true scream that doesn't sound human, something that feels like it reaches out to grab you in the dark and frees you where you stand. My sisters and I stumbled out into the hallway, barely awake and totally clueless. The house was still dark except for the weak glow of the Christmas lights from the living room. My youngest sister clutched my arm, her eyes wide and frantic. We all stayed still, paralyzed, listening to that awful silence after a scream. But then, a faint sound took over. Footsteps. A man's footsteps. He wasn't like a shadow. He was more real than that. The closer he came, the clearer his face was, even in the dark. And it wasn't the face of someone we knew. Not a neighbor, not a family friend, not even a stranger you'd see in the street. Something was off. Something that told all of us, that he shouldn't be there. Shh. He brought his index finger to his lips. That's when it came to light, the glimmering blade. He was holding a knife. Its cold metal glinted, even in the weak Christmas lights that danced along the walls. He didn't move like a man who was lost or scared. He moved with purpose. His eyes locked on us, not in a way that was angry or even rushed, just deliberate. My mother, who I noticed cornered behind the tree, screamed again. It was a sound of pure terror, a sound that seemed to come from her very soul. We wanted to run, but it was as if we were all glued to the floor. I'd read about the fight or flight response, but I never knew about freeze. That's what it felt like everything around us had stopped, and we were just stuck there, trapped in some horrifying nightmare we couldn't wake up from. I heard a shuffle, a muffling sound, and my mother's voice rose in a high-pitched whimper. I saw her then, lying against the wall, clutching her stomach. Her hands were red and sticky. Blood, so much of it. She tried to stand, but couldn't. Her face twisted with pain, fear, and something else, like she was begging us not to be there, to go away, as if that would keep us safe. He didn't stop. He just stood there, towering over her. His chest heaved as he held the knife out. His breathing filled the room, almost rhythmic. It was the only sound other than the faint buzz of the Christmas lights. And then, without a word, he lifted the knife again, so calm like it was nothing, and brought it down hard. I don't remember the scream that came out of me. I don't even know if it was real or just in my head, but it was like something broke inside of me, like the scream was everything I was in that moment. Every terrified second stretched out as he lifted the knife again and again. I could feel the warmth of my sister's hand trembling against mine. She was sobbing, but it was silent. Her face was buried in my arm as her tiny frame shook with fear. I wanted to cover her eyes, but I couldn't move. I just couldn't. The knife kept coming down, each time a thud, each time another flash of blood. The way he moved, it was like he was possessed, like he wasn't even human. His face held this expression, one I can still see if I close my eyes. Blank, emotionless, like it was nothing to him, just a task, something he was supposed to do. I realized then that he'd come for her. It wasn't a robbery, but a homicide. He looked up once, finally, his eyes finding us through the dark, and for a moment, his lips curved. Not a smile, not quite, but close, like he knew he'd won, like he knew this night, this Christmas, was his. As I held my sister tighter, the sound of sirens pierced through the air. Red and blue lights started flashing through the windows, cutting into the room, throwing shadows across the walls, and he stepped back, just once, just long enough for me to see what he'd done. Mom was silent, still, her eyes open, but not seeing us anymore. The man was gone before the police got there, vanishing into the cold Christmas night, leaving behind nothing but the echo of that awful scream, the red stains across the floor, and the hollow space that my mother used to fill. They never found him. The questions were left hanging, and we were left wondering. And every Christmas since, it's like she's there with us, her face pale and her eyes wide, forever trapped in that night. Only the lights feel dimmer, the laughter quieter, like even our happiest moments are haunted by her memory. Christmas isn't the same, and it never will be. It was December 22nd, 2013, and Patricia Burns was making turkey on Christmas Eve with her 2 daughters when her ex, Clifford Burns, stopped by the house wearing a mask. He stabbed Patricia to death right in that kitchen. Unfortunately, her teenage daughters watched their mother meet a horrifying end before calling 911 for help. Clifford Burns gave reason that he just wanted to see his daughters after the rocky marriage with Patricia. Burns, 46, was charged with second-degree murder. He accepted a plea deal and was sentenced to 23 years to life behind bars. Being an orphan, every year my friend Julia's family invited me to their Christmas dinner. I remember the garland wrapped around their front door and the scent of pine and cinnamon spilling out as I walked in. The whole family of 10 was there, kids and adults, but this year the energy was off. Julia's eyes kept darting toward the door.
Are you okay? Waiting for someone?
Julia sighed.
Just worried Brent might show up.
Brent was her ex-husband, a loose cannon. They married when they were 18 and divorced just 5 years later. He was abusive, reckless, and everyone but Julia saw it coming from a mile away. They'd been going through a nasty divorce, and he'd lost custody of their son Peter just weeks before. I'd only met him a few times, but that was enough to feel his intensity. Brent had this presence about him, something dark.
I told him he couldn't see Peter until after the holidays, but he's not taking no very well. He got a restraining order. Don't worry, you're with family.
She managed a weak smile, but I could see the worry on her face. Later, while we were gathered around the tree, there was a knock at the door. Julia's face went pale, and the laughter in the room died instantly. I got up to answer it, expecting to brush off some random visitor, but as I opened the door, my breath caught. It was Brent, dressed as Santa Claus. He had the red suit, the hat, and even a fake white beard that only half covered his face. But it wasn't a joyful Santa standing there. His eyes were cold, focused. He clutched a massive, bulging sack over his shoulder.
Brent, you're not allowed to be here.
He pushed me aside and barged in. Ho, ho, ho! Julia gasped, clutching Peter close to her. I just came to bring gifts for my son. It's Christmas after all. The room was quiet.
You need to leave, Brent.
His eyes narrowed. I came all this way. Let me see my son just for a minute. A tense silence filled the room. I could feel the unease building as Brent's gaze drifted to each of us. Then he reached into the sack and pulled out something long and metallic, wrapped in shimmering paper. He ripped it open, revealing a shotgun.
Brent, what the hell?
Before I could even process it, he raised the gun, pointing it around the room as he spoke, his voice eerily calm. You all turned on me. You took everything. I just want my family back. The room erupted into chaos. Julia screamed, pulling Peter behind her as people scrambled for cover. I froze, feeling a numb sort of horror wash over me as Brent started firing shots. I jumped behind the couch, grabbing Julia's hand and pulling her along as she clutched Peter. Brent shot her dad twice in the chest, then chased her mom into the kitchen where he ended her. I could hear him talking, almost to himself, rambling about betrayal, about everything he'd lost. His voice was a blend of bitterness and raw fury, and it sent chills down my spine. They took away my everything! My everything! My everything! Somehow, we managed to crawl toward the back hallway, and Julia and I ushered Peter into a closet. I handed her my phone, whispering that she should call the police while I tried to draw Brent away. I made my way to the front door, hoping he'd see me from the kitchen and follow. I glimpsed the destruction behind, the shattered decorations, the spilled drinks, the smear of blood on the floor. Brent shouted from the kitchen, "You're not trying to leave the party early, are you, Alyssa?" I bolted, but he shot at me. He hit my leg and I went down. That was the most afraid I'd been, as I desperately crawled to the door while he walked up to me, ready with his gun. I saw Julia's brother and uncle lying in blood nearby, and I knew that my fate would be the same. But just as he was about to shoot, Julia jumped out of nowhere. She wrestled him and yelled at me to leave. I got up on one leg and hopped out, rushing to the neighbors for help, who were already out. That's when we all heard 2 more shots go off. The police cars arrived quickly and they barged in, only to find a bloody Santa with his son sitting in his lap, a shotgun lying at his feet, beside the body of Julia. Brent was taken away, sentenced to a lifetime in prison. I took the custody of Julia's son and lost his entire family to that madman. It's a wound we could never heal from. This story is inspired from the Covina Massacre, one of the most shocking crimes in recent American history, which occurred on Christmas Eve 2008. Bruce Jeffrey Pardo, recently divorced and deeply resentful, arrived at his former in-laws' home in Covina, California, dressed in a Santa Claus suit. The family was celebrating their annual Christmas gathering, with about 25 relatives and friends in attendance. Without warning, Pardo entered the house and opened fire with semi-automatic handguns, instantly killing several guests. He then used a homemade flamethrower to set the house ablaze, causing the residence to burn down completely. 9 people, including his ex-wife, Sylvia Pardo, lost their lives that night. After the rampage, Pardo drove to his brother's house where he later took his own life. The massacre was motivated by a bitter divorce and Pardo's financial struggles. He had recently lost his job and was forced to pay significant alimony to his ex-wife. At 67, I had learned to value every relationship I cultivated, especially those that blossomed from trust and affection. Patty Michelle White seemed like an ordinary woman on the surface, but her story was more complicated than it appeared. We met years ago through my family, at one of our many family parties. She was a friend of my nephew's, and at first I didn't think much of her. However, when she found herself in a dark place in her life, facing financial difficulties, I decided to open the door of my home to her. I offered her a place to stay, something I thought would help her find her way. I remember the first day she arrived at my house. She had a small suitcase and a shy smile, perhaps a little nervous.
Thank you, Michelle. This means so much,
she said. I looked into her eyes and she seemed like a grateful woman. I could only pity her for what she was going through. In time, we shared more than just a space. We even had late-night conversations, which were honestly the best part of my days. We talked about life, lost dreams, and the choices that had brought us to where we were.
Remember when we were young and thought we'd have it all figured out by this age?
I would joke.
Yeah, and here we are, just trying to survive.
I would reply, laughing at how ironic life can be. As the weeks went by, Patty became part of my routine. I even let her use my car to run errands, and I shared my debit card PIN with her so she could buy food for both of us. It was a mutual trust that bordered on blind faith, and she often told me she thought of me as a mother. She made me feel useful, like I was reliving my parental days. One afternoon, my twin brother Phil came to visit, eager to meet Patty. "It's always good to meet new friends," he told me as he sat in the kitchen sipping a cup of coffee. Patty just walked in, smiling and bringing freshly baked cookies. It was quite a pleasant afternoon. She talked about her problems with her ex, her financial situation, and how she was trying to get her job back, but she always seemed motivated. "She's taking good care of you, huh?" Phil said to Patty in a joking tone.
I'm definitely stealing some of her love,
She replied, laughing. I felt a warmth in my chest, a joy at the connection we had made. As the weeks turned into months and Christmas approached, we decorated the house together, creating a festive atmosphere filled with laughter. The thought of spending the holidays with someone I had come to love like a daughter was exciting, and this year, the big annual party would be at my house. Little did I know the gift my good friend Patty had prepared for me. One day, while I was in my room, I decided it would be a good idea to give Patty a key to the house.
This is just to make you feel more comfortable here,
I said, as I handed it to her with a smile. She took it with trembling hands, her face reflecting a mixture of happiness and something else I couldn't identify. I even felt compassion, realizing that no one had ever treated her this well. A few days later, as I was getting ready to host some friends for dinner, I noticed that Patty seemed a little more nervous than usual. I saw her pacing the house, her gaze restless, as if waiting for something.
Everything okay, Patty?
I asked her, and she smiled, but something in her eyes didn't match her expression. On the evening of the 6th of December, Phil came to see me again. During dinner, he couldn't stop laughing and telling stories from our childhood while Patty served the food, but only he and I were laughing. She looked quite serious and lost in thought, which worried us both. Finally, after Phil left, we were alone in the house, surrounded by twinkling lights and the smell of freshly baked cookies. I felt comfortable and confident, as if everything were fine. But what I didn't know was that the night ahead was going to change everything.
Patty, you scared me. Patty?
Michelle O'Dowd, a 67-year-old Florida resident, was found murdered on December 2, 2011. Her twin brother, Phil Axt, discovered her in her apartment after growing concerned about her absence from work. The scene was horrifying. Michelle had been beaten, strangled, and her body was hidden beneath Christmas gifts. The apartment was in disarray, with valuables missing, including her debit card, which had been used at nearby ATMs and captured on security cameras. The main suspect, Patty Michelle White, a 37-year-old family friend, had lived with Michelle for a time and had access to her home and cards. It was revealed that White had returned to Florida from South Carolina with the intent to rob her. Phil Axt described his sister as a sweet and innocent person and expressed his anguish over her brutal murder. White confessed to the crime after being apprehended in South Carolina and was extradited to Florida, where she was sentenced to 45 years in prison for murder and robbery. The investigation was led by the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office.